in our exam readiness series. I'm Carla Yun, and this series aims at getting you ready, prepped, and confident for that final grade 12 NSC Dance Studies Paper 1 Theory examination. Sure, that was a mouthful. Before we get into today's subject-specific content, just a few reminders. From here on out, we're going to be looking at question-specific content, right? So we've done the format, we've done the verbs, all of the general things. Now we're going to be looking at specific content per question. So from this point, it will be useful for you to have stationery, pens, pencils, highlighters. You're also going to need your trial paper, your question paper, as well as your answer script. It will be a good idea to make little notes on your question paper, on your answer script, so that you can also see how you've answered, where your answers fell short a little bit, where you answered well, and how to improve going forward into your final exam. Okay, so today we are going to start with question 1, the first question in the question paper, which is on injuries. But before we look at injuries, seeing as we're talking about question 1 now, I'd like to know from you, what is your exam answering strategy? How do you like to go about answering your question paper, right? And it's different for everybody. Some people like to answer from question 1 and work chronologically. So in other words, they go 1, 2, 3, all the way through to question 8. Some people prefer to start with section B first, the longer sections first, because those are where all the marks are loaded. So those people would start at question 5, 6, 7, 8, and then go back to section A. Some people like to start with their strongest question first, the one they like first. So for example, I know that I like the section on components of fitness. That's my favorite section, and that's question 2. So I'm going to start answering with question 2 first. Remember, you can answer your question paper in any order, so it really is up to you. What is your style? How do you prefer to answer the questions? Let us know in the comment section below. It will be interesting to see how different people go about answering the question paper. Alright, so let's get into the specifics of question 1 on injuries. What are the sorts of questions that you could be asked? So there are 4 different things you could be asked in this question, right? So firstly, you could be asked to name specific dance-related injuries. You could also be asked on what the causes of injuries are. What are the specific things that could cause you to get an injury? Then you could be asked on what are the things that you need to do to prevent getting an injury. And if you think about it cleverly, actually those two are opposite. Causes and prevention would be opposite from one another. So if you know the one, you actually already know the other, right? So that's already 3 things. And then the last one is treatment. So you could be asked, once you are already injured, what do you need to do in order to treat that injury and eventually rehabilitate yourself to go back into dancing? Alright, so now let's go a little bit more in detail to each one of those 4 things. So what are the types of injuries that you possibly could be asked on, right? So the first 2 are sprains and strains. So remember, sprains and strains, these are to do with muscles, tendons and ligaments, and it's usually a pull or a tear. And sprains and strains are the 2 most common types of injuries that are related to dance. Alright, then we also get things like tendinitis, shin splints that affect the front of the shins, and then more serious things such as fractures and broken bones, which we hope that you will not encounter in your dancing career or in your dance training. Alright, then if we look at causes, so injuries can be caused by one of three things, 3 broad categories, right? So the first thing is to do with your environment that you find yourself in. Secondly, a cause could be to do with your lifestyle choices. And then thirdly, the most common, it could be to do with your actual dancing, your actual technique, yeah, when you're actually practicing dance techniques. So what are the things that could cause an injury to do with your dance environment. So it could be things like dancing on an inappropriate floor. In other words, a floor that is not well suited to dance. It could be things to do with the temperature of the space. Maybe you're dancing in a space that is too hot or too cold, that makes your body more prone to injury. It could also be to do with the size of the space. Maybe the studio is too small to accommodate the number of dancers in the space. Maybe the space is cluttered with, maybe it's a normal classroom and it's got desks and chairs that makes the space cluttered and unsafe to use for dance. And then lastly, to do with your dance environment, it could be things to do with what you are wearing. Are you wearing, you could be wearing inappropriate clothing for dance. So maybe you're dancing in your school uniform and it actually restricts your movement. Or maybe you're wearing very baggy clothes and socks and it causes you to slip and fall in the dance space. Okay, secondly, causes could be to do with lifestyle choices. So things like not getting enough sleep, lack of sleep could make your body more prone to injury. Having a poor diet or a diet that doesn't give your body the necessary nutrients it needs in order to perform when you're dancing. Also things like dehydration, and as well as things like stress and tension, which can cause stiff muscles and other tension in the body. And then lastly, the most common causes of injuries are things related to your actual dance technique. So things like actually practicing incorrect dance techniques, things like not warming up and cooling down sufficiently before and after class, things like having underdeveloped components of fitness. So in other words, you're not fit enough and therefore your body is at the risk of getting injured. As well as overuse of the body, so training too much, and the opposite of that as well, training too little. So all of those things are causes of injuries. Right, then if we look at prevention of injuries, we said it would be the opposite of all the things that we've just listed in causes, right? So if we look at how to prevent an injury in terms of our environment, it means dancing on an appropriate floor, so preferably a sprung wooden floor, making sure that the temperature is correct in the room, in other words, not too hot and not too cold, making sure that the space is big enough for all of the dancers to move in so that they don't bump into one another and it is safe, and then also wearing appropriate dance clothing that doesn't restrict your movements and is not too big that causes you to slip and fall. Then when we look at lifestyle choices, things like making sure that you're getting enough sleep is going to prevent injuries, making sure that you've got a balanced diet and are well hydrated so that your body can function at its best, and then making sure that you are practicing relaxation techniques so that your body is not under too much stress and tension. And then we spoke about the things that are to do with your technique. So making sure that when you are dancing, you are focused, you're concentrating on what you're doing and you're committed to the movements. You're aware that you are practicing correct posture, you've got good alignment and you're using the joints and the spine safely when you're moving. You're applying correct dance techniques when you're dancing. And then, of course, you also have well-developed components of fitness that are going to enable you to move efficiently so that your body does not get injured. All right, and then let's look at treatment of injuries. So as soon as you hear that word treatment of injuries, ding, 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 rice should be the first thing. It should be going off like red flashing lights. As soon as you hear treatment, you should immediately think rice, because that is the first thing that you do when you are treating an injury. Rice is that first immediate treatment. So remember, rest, ice, compression, elevation. Sometimes that acronym has a P inserted into it as well in brackets, so price. But remember, the P stands for, or the P is for prevention. If you are already injured and they ask you for treatment, you can't put the P there because you haven't done prevention. You're already injured. So then it starts at RICE. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. And you've got to be able to explain each one of those four things, right? And then beyond rice, what happens if your injury is a little bit more serious and rice isn't enough? Then we're looking at things like alternative treatment. So what would you need to do to rehabilitate yourself? It could be things like seeking medical care. Maybe you need to go to a physiotherapist who gives you specific exercises to rehabilitate that part that is injured. Or you need to be doing non-weight bearing exercises or gentler exercises before you go back into dancing. Remember, all of this is dependent on how severe the injury is. And then, of course, also when we're looking at treatments, we're looking at what happens, the longer term effects when you are recovering from an injury, because it probably means that you won't be able to dance full out at that time. So what are the things that you need to do so that you can aid in recovering from your injury before returning to full-time dancing? Alright, so that was question 1. I hope that made it a little bit more clear. If you've got any questions or comments on this section of the work on dance-related injuries, make sure to leave it in the comment section below and we will get back to you. Alright guys, all the best. See you in the next one. Bye.